back, everyone, to another season of NHL Hockey Talk on the Puck Drop Podcast. Good to be back, as always, and awesome seeing hockey back as the preseason is already underway. Now, I've voiced my displeasure about the preseason before, but hey, last night I went to the Habs Flyers preseason game, and just being back at the Bell Center in the atmosphere, surrounded by hockey, preseason or not, it felt amazing. So things are good. I hope everyone had a great summer, and thank you all for joining us for a third season of this podcast. Now, as usual, our preseason episodes are going to be divisional previews, and that starts today. But before we do get into our first divisional discussion, there are a few key things that happened over the offseason that are worth noting. Now, I'm not going to go into all the talk about all the free agent signings that happened over the offseason because we're obviously going to get to that when we cover each and every team one by one. But one thing worth discussing before diving in is the new CBA that was agreed upon this summer, and it will be taken into effect on September 16th of next year, 2026. However, some new rules will be implemented this season, which is why I want to tackle this before we talk divisions, because it's going to be relevant when I talk about contracts or, what teams may or may not do throughout the season or at the trade deadline. So that's something we should talk about. Also, it's just very good for any hockey fan to understand what's going to be happening regarding the CBA. So firstly, one of the biggest changes of the new CBA is the playoff LTIR. Now, we know that this has been a topic of discussion for a while, a big issue to a lot of teams and a lot of fans. So to start, before we even look at the playoffs, teams will now only get the full relief of their injured player's salary cap if that player is ruled out for the entire regular season and playoffs. So it's got to be determined that the player is not coming back for the rest of the season or the playoffs if that team wants to use their entire cap for relief. So already a team will not be able to milk a big contract relief during the season just to have that player come back in the playoffs, like we have seen in the past with some examples: Nikita Kucherov, Mark Stone, Matthew Tkachuk. A lot of teams have done this in the past, but that's no longer going to be allowed. If they want full relief from a player's cap, that player cannot play for the remainder of the season and playoffs. Now, for players injured throughout the season and placed on LTIR with the plan of being reactivated for playoffs, instead of getting full cap relief of that player's salary cap, the team can only get the maximum relief, which is equal to the previous season's league average salary. So for this coming season, that average salary is $3.82 million because that was the league average last season. So going into the 2026-2027 season, the maximum relief will be this year's average salary. I know it sounds confusing, but I'm sure you're going to get it as the year goes on and you see how teams make this work. Now, keep in mind, this relief is only for the regular season. Teams will need to be cap compliant by the first game of playoffs. Now, it gets even a little more complicated when we talk about prorating the cap hit of retained players. We're not going to get into that too much, but basically a team who trades away a player and retains cap, that cap is prorated based on how many games that player played for them, that team that traded them. So if a team retains 25% of a player's cap hit, and that player played half the season with the team before they were traded, then their cap hit for the playoffs is half of 25%, which is effectively 12.5%. I'm trying to think of an easy example to make it simple to understand. Let's look at Jack Eichel because I think he's got an exact $10 million cap hit. Let's say, it's not going to happen, but let's say the Vegas Golden Knights trade him and retain 25% of his cap. So you would think the Vegas Golden Knights are on the hook for 2.5 mil throughout the season. But if they trade him at the exact 41 game mark, so he played half the season with Vegas, and then they traded him and retained 25%. When the playoffs start that year, the Vegas Golden Knights are only on the hook for 12.5% of Eichel's cap, which in a sense is dead cap or retained cap because he's no longer with the Vegas Golden Knights. I hope I'm explaining that properly. I know it gets a bit tricky, but we're not finished there. The acquiring team, however, does not get a prorated cap hit. So they took on 75% of the player's cap when they acquired him. Again, this is just an example. Regardless of how many games that player played for them, their playoff cap hit for that player is the full 75% or whatever they took on initially when they traded for that player. You still with me, Randy? Good. Great. Now, the other change that will be in effect this year is the double retained contracts. Teams are no longer able to do a double retention. So, that is something that we've seen at trade deadlines when we hear of a three-way trade and one team is simply there to retain some of the cap of the player to help the other two teams execute the trade. There now needs to be a 75-day buffer or gap between retentions on a player's contract. So if, let's say, Bowen Byram gets traded and Buffalo decides to retain 25% of his cap, the team that got him then decides to flip him. Well, they cannot retain any of his contract unless there's been at least 75 days since that first retention was made. So if we look at an example from last year's deadline, let's say Trent Frederick. He was traded from the Bruins to the Oilers, but there was a third team involved, the New Jersey Devils. Technically, Boston traded Frederick to the New Jersey Devils. Boston retained some money, and then that same day, New Jersey traded him to Edmonton, and they also retained some money. This would not be allowed under the new CBA. So starting this year, that is no longer possible. So these two changes mentioned above will definitely impact how teams are going to be approaching the trade deadline. Now, if anyone listens to the Elliot Friedman podcast, 32 Thoughts, he explains how this might ruin the excitement of the trade deadline, as it's going to be a lot harder for teams to acquire big name players at the deadline, both because of less cap relief and the inability to retain twice. That said, a lot of the selling teams might look to sell even earlier in the season rather than wait for the deadline like they have in the past. The value of a player won't necessarily be at its highest at the deadline because of the increased difficulty it is to acquire key players at the deadline. Obviously, these key players come with huge caps for the most part. So not being able to have, two teams involved to retain, 50% each, bringing the total value of the contract down to 25% for the acquiring team. This is no longer possible. So it's just going to be a lot harder for the teams contending to win a cup to squeeze in another superstar into their cap hit. Now, the rest of the changes to the CBA won't be in effect this season, but we could run through them real quick. The ones worth mentioning are the changes to contract terms. As it has been for the last decade or so, teams were allowed to sign players in their organization to a maximum of 8 years, and teams from outside of their organization, aka free agents, to 7-year deals. Both these are being reduced by 1 year. So now teams can sign free agents to a maximum of 6-year contracts, and they can extend players on their current roster to 7-year deals. So just like it's been for a while, minus 1 year. Another pretty big change is that the regular season is also going to be increased to 84 games instead of 82, which is something that we haven't seen since the early 90s. And I believe that was only a thing for like 2 seasons in the early 90s. Now, with this also comes a shortened preseason, thank God. And other changes of the CBA, I'm honestly not going to get into because they aren't as relevant to the average hockey fan. But really quick, it's like league minimum salary, entry level max compensation, different changes to qualifying offers, performance bonuses. There's an e-bug change, which is kind of a fun one, but honestly not really worth talking about because I'm already confusing the hell out of all you guys with this whole CBA talk. And then one more change that's actually kind of big is players with 0 games of NHL experience will be required to wear cut resistant neck protection starting in the 26-27 season. So not this year, but next year. And it's one of those rules that are kind of grandfathered in. So any rookie starting that year, again, not this year, but next year, is going to have to wear some sort of neck protection. And that's going to, move forward for all new players. So in 10 years from now, pretty much all players in the NHL are going to have neck guards. Not necessarily the full neck guards that, younger kids wear, but, neck protection, some sort of turtleneck or cut resistant neck protection. So that's something that's going to be implemented in the NHL in the coming years. It's going to be a different look for people like myself who have watched hockey our whole lives, but I'm sure our parents said that back in the day when there was no helmets and then players had to start wearing helmets. changes the way things look. I wonder if the neck guards, the neck protections are going to be color coded, like part of the uniform. Like they color the pants and the socks and everything. I wonder if the neck guards are going to be now part of the uniform. We'll see how that's going to go. But for now, that's all we got for rule changes for today. Now it's time to dive into what we actually came here for. Now, just a heads up, don't mind the little sound change because this part was recorded after the divisional breakdown because I decided to add this into the start of the episode when I realized how relevant it was to a lot of the contract talk I was doing. Now, with that out of the way, it's time to get into our Atlantic Division preview. Like last year, I'm starting off with the Atlantic Division because I believe it's going to be the strongest division in the NHL. You could use the fact that the last 7 Stanley Cup final teams out of the East were from this division. Actually, 8 if you include the Tampa Montreal finals in that weird COVID season. The top teams in the division are still powerful contenders. Any one of them could make it out of the East. And then some of the bottom teams, they keep making pushes for the playoffs. But then there's our bottom team yet again. And that is where we're going to be starting at the bottom, working our way up. And my prediction for this upcoming season, I'm sure you could all guess where I'm going with this. It is the Buffalo Sabres. Now, it feels crazy to have this team at the bottom yet again. It just doesn't make sense for a team to be in a slump for over a decade without making any sort of significant push. For a 14th straight season, the Buffalo Sabres missed the playoffs. And yet again, they weren't really in the mix. They were more than 10 points out of the last wildcard spot in the East last year and finishing only above the Boston Bruins in the Atlantic. It's been an extremely rough time for Sabres fans, and you're going to be hearing from one very soon. They've probably had it worse than any other fan base in all of major four sports. I know the New York Jets have had it pretty bad. They might be tied with the Sabres for the longest drought. I don't know. We'll look into that after. But the Sabres have been bad for very long. The closest they came to making the playoffs was 3 seasons ago when they missed the playoffs by 1 point, just behind the Panthers, who ended up going on to the finals that year. But instead of continuing that trend upwards, they went right back down to the basement of the East. They actually started off last season fairly decent. They were above 500 after 20 games, opening the season 11-9-1. And what followed that was an atrocious 13-game losing streak, which pretty much ended their playoff chances early. And unfortunately, nothing really tells me this year that anything's going to be different for the Buffalo Sabres. Let's look at some of their moves from the offseason, and then I'm going to bring in a big-time Sabres fan to help break down what this team could look like in this upcoming season. Some of the players that the Buffalo Sabres lost over the offseason: J.J. Peterka, Sam Lafferty, Cale Clegg, Jacob Bernard-Docker, Connor Clifton, Eric Brandstrom, and James Reimer. Some of these names obviously more important than others, but we'll get to that. And then some of the big acquisitions for the Buffalo Sabres: Josh Doan, Michael Kesselring, Bowen Byram, Alex Lyon, Justin Danforth, and Connor Timmins. Now, I believe I might be missing one or two, but we'll be getting to that. Now, from these moves alone, we can see that Sabres management decided to sacrifice a bit of their offense to bolster their defense, which isn't a bad move considering that offense was actually their strong point last year. They finished 10th in goals per game. That said, their power play wasn't great. It was 18.8%, which was 23rd in the league, and now they go on without their second best offensive weapon in J.J. Peterka. So that alone would have me assuming that their offense will take a big hit this year. But the emergence of young players like Benson, Coolidge, Quinn, and now even Josh Doan could help flip the script on their offense this year. Another positive from last season was superstar Tage Thompson showing his true form again, putting up 44 goals and almost being back to a point per game. I also think not making Team USA at the Four Nations is something that he's going to bring into the season, a little chip on his shoulder. I'm sure a lot of Sabres fans would love to see that. And now this is the perfect timing for me to be bringing in a buddy of mine who's been a long-time Sabres fan, who's lived through all the misery of being a Sabres fan for the past 15 years. Praz, how you doing?
I'm doing good, and yes, misery is a perfect way of putting it. Like,
Yeah, yeah, I feel for you. It's been tough. So tell me what you think of the team this year. We kind of talked about the roster just before you got on, but what do you think what do you think of the moves in the offseason first?
moves itself, I don't hate them by any means. Like the JJ Paterka one's definitely a very interesting one, but the guy was very unhappy, didn't want to be there. I think the return, obviously, everybody says it could have been a little bit better, but I think the main focus was trying to shore up that defense and find finally a long-term partner for Owen Power. And I think Kesselring definitely does that. Josh Stone, sorry. Definitely seems like an interesting add-on to that. Haven't really seen much of him or what he's really done. I know he's got a couple stints in the NHL for a couple games here and there, and he hasn't had the worst career per se. Definitely not his father by any means, but then again, who really is? Yeah, that's an interesting one to me. The one that definitely stands out. The rest of the roster, personally, I like the fact that they got rid of a lot of the smaller D that we had on the team and kind of went with size over everything. Defense has definitely been the number one issue of this team for years. So anything that can bolster that on the back end would be great. Wasn't really thrilled on the goaltending moves, to be fair. Like I think Alex Leon's a great guy, good goalie, but not anything to really like, moves the needle per se. Like I think it's kind of like a lateral move with the James Reimer option on the back end. So yeah, it's basically all I got for that right now.
Is there
Um,
a timeline for Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen to come back this season?
not sure. They said he looks on track, but who really knows? I think it was a groin injury, is what they were saying, or something like that. Anytime you get
That's
injured before training camp even starts, especially as a goalie, probably not the best signs going
yeah.
forward. I was
So
hoping he was going to have a big bounce back year. Didn't have the greatest season last year after signing that contract extension. This seems to be, the norm for any player that signs in Buffalo. That as soon as they sign, they have a terrible year the following year. Um, big looking really excited though for Tage Thompson, like you said. Hopefully he's gonna have a nice big chip on his shoulder, have a nice bounce back season. I think Alex Tuck's gonna have a great year because he's in a contract year. I know they want to re-sign him, but who knows what's gonna happen? Because like he's definitely a very valuable asset. Plays almost every game of the season. Had what almost 40 goals last season. It's just been consistent year in and year out. So yeah,
so let's say everybody's healthy going into the season. Who do you have as the number one C?
like the number one center on
Yeah.
this team. Well, I'd have to go with Norris. That's just kind of has to be Josh Norris straight up, and then you can interchange um, McLeod and Coolidge for second. But Norris, I think, gets should definitely get the reins. He only played 3 games with the Sabres, so it's kind of hard to kind of give a like how he
Yeah.
looked with the team. Like he's a solid guy, but it's just like he would be number one center. The question is for how many games before he goes down with an injury is the real thing on
That's
that one.
that's the big problem. His whole career he's been injury ridden. But if healthy, like down the middle, they look good all the way down to their fourth line. Peyton Krebs on the fourth line, solid. He's only
Yeah,
he's how old is he?
it's like 24, I think.
Right, so he's hopefully only getting better. And then you mentioned Coolidge and then McLeod, who they got last year from Edmonton. So down the middle, solid. They had to sacrifice one of their wingers, JG Paterka, but like you said, they bolstered their defense. You were talking about getting that right-handed shot for Owen Power, so that's huge.
I think the
Um,
biggest fact on defense too is the fact that you get to keep Darlene on that right hand side. And I think that's going to do wonders. Him and Byram together were fantastic last year. The fact that you got Byram now locked in for another 2 years, solid, at least it gives you some stability on the back end. And I think having Darlene play on that right side now, not have to worry about him playing lefty is going to be huge for him. He played all of his junior hockey or European junior hockey on the right side. And it's a big change from going from right D when you're used to playing it as a left-hand defenseman and going back to that left side. It takes a lot to get
for
used
sure.
to it again. Like I'm not talking from my own experience. Like I only played beer league, but I used to play right D and I'm a left-handed shot. And I know just trying to remember the angles and the cutoffs to do that just in beer league is difficult enough. I couldn't imagine doing it at an NHL level.
Yeah,
So I think having him locked in on that right side is going to be great with a nice big defensive core all the way through the lineup, which would be great. So I think that's pretty good.
That definitely helps. Talking Bowen Byram though, he was a top trade target last year, all last year, especially at the deadline. And it
Mhm.
seemed all but guaranteed that they were going to move him in the summer. And then that signing came, that 2 year deal that you just mentioned. So if you're Buffalo management, are you still shopping Byram, or would this new contract keep him for at least a year? He's now part of the core. What do you think?
I think you at least keep him for a year, unless the team just comes off the rails completely this season. And it's like, if you're already out by December, like, I think everybody's for sale on the team at that point, kind of thing. I would be shocked if they moved him after, because like I don't think he was really. I think the team wasn't really looking to move him because when you find a defenseman like that, it's very hard to get them. So you have to get an absolute haul for them in return to kind of get rid of them. Um, I don't know. Like me asking me as what I would do personally, I would hold on to him for at least a season. What the management is going to do, honestly, I have no idea because like most of the last few seasons, I really don't think this management has any direction with this team per
Yeah,
se. Um, I'm just a hopeful fan because like,
gotta be.
what else can I do? You just gotta believe it's gonna get through at one point. And like we've had it terrible. I think the Browns fans of Cleveland have definitely had it way worse than we ever have. So, okay, like
Okay,
we're definitely
yeah.
close. We're close, but I'll
Yeah,
still take the Browns.
I saw you make a face when I said Sabres
Yeah.
fans have had it worse. So
Don't get me wrong. As the NHL over the last like half century, probably by far the worst. Yeah.
right,
Like
right.
no chance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough and it's honestly hard to pinpoint exactly why. Like you said, management is unpredictable. The Bowen Byram trade, they probably won that trade because Casey Middlestat has bounced around. He hasn't really done
Yeah.
much. He's a bottom six guy now. Um, what do you think is the reason why they haven't been able to break out of this slump that they've been in for so long? My first thought is drafting because that is what bottom teams should do well. Aside from Zach Benson, like if you go back a couple years post Owen Power, so let's look at the last 4 years. Their first round picks, Hellenius from 2 years ago. I mean, I know he's still young, but do you have any hope for this guy? Is he going to be an
Yeah,
NHLer?
apparently, like from everything I've heard about him in Rochester last season, good potential two-way center going forward, like top six two-way center. So I don't mind that one. I think the last couple of years they've definitely had some draft picks that I've definitely been questionable about. A lot of them are just sitting in Rochester right now, just kind of waiting for a chance. You got Isaac Rosen as well. Um, who's the other one? Well, the kind of thing you drafted Rosen, Osland, and Yuri Kulich in that same draft, all in the top three, all in the first round. And Kulich was the last one of that round and has the most amount of NHL experience so far. So definitely, if you're what you're saying, if you're drafting that high, you definitely don't want to miss on those kind of picks. And the fact that your third option in that draft is your best player out of all of them definitely means you missed on the first two. I'm not saying these guys aren't going to be anything, but I'm not opposed to the development, but I also kind of want to see something outside of like success in Rochester would be
Yeah,
nice.
for sure. I mean, I look at it now. I see. So Rosen was actually the same year as Power. He was their second pick the Power year. But the
Okay, sorry.
Coolidge year was Matthew Savoy, who they traded for Ryan
Yes.
McLeod.
Sorry, but they also drafted Oslin, I think, in that
Yes.
same. Yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
they had
Yeah.
three first round picks and missed on two of them. Yeah.
So do you think the Savoy trade was the right move?
I think it was like well, Savoy hasn't done anything right now. He's just still sitting in Edmonton, was in the lower end, and McLeod has been fantastic. I've only seen him for one season, but like when they first made the trade, I thought it was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. But then again, as a Sabres fan, you kind of get used to that.
Yeah.
But I thought McLeod was actually fantastic last season. No complaints out of him. Thought he had a great two-way game, a lot more speed than I thought he had, and way more offensive upside than I ever expected out of him. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Funny enough, I thought it was a stupid trade for the Oilers, a team who was just
No,
at the
the
Cup
opposite was.
Finals. They needed to win, and they traded a player in their roster. That said, obviously they needed to clear cap, and I mean Savoy's still young. You never know.
The
But
same problem though. It's too small, injury prone. kind of guy. It looked like it was happening. So I'm not a big fan of drafting small end forwards in the first round, kind of thing. Like not that high, at least. I feel like definitely has been a shift in the NHL, but you notice it a lot more with playoffs. Like I don't know if I'm ever going to experience that again, but like when your team does make the playoffs, you want to have some bigger body guys that have that top end talent. That
But one of your best first round picks of late was Zach Benson, and he's a smaller guy.
Yes, he has had an interesting 2 seasons, I would say. Like I expected a little bit more of a step forward last season from him. Um, he has looked good though. He is a little bit smaller, like you said. But I think he's focused a little bit more on his defensive side of the game, which as a younger player, I'm definitely very happy about. Just want to see that offense kind of see what he has now that he has the opportunity on that top line now with Norris and Thompson. So he's gonna have some big shoes to fill, and he's definitely gonna have a lot of expectations this season.
Yeah. Probably the nicest first NHL goal of all time.
The through
Always
the
gonna,
legs, yep,
yeah, gonna
absolutely
remember him for that.
disgusting.
That
Yeah,
was very, very nice.
interesting to see what happens with Jack Quinn too, because that's an interesting one for me because he had an unbelievable breakout year coming in as a rookie, and then injuries and down seasons, and seemed to find it at the end of last season a little bit. Found his scoring touch again, so definitely interesting to see what he does there. I think him on third line's a perfect position for him. Doesn't have to worry about going against those top end defensemen and top end forwards. So hopefully he can, mold into that a little bit better this season.
15 goals and 24 assists from Quinn last year. Not bad for 22-year-olds. And like you said, getting third line minutes, that's enough to
Yeah.
ask for. I guess the only thing I've left are what do you think this team needs to do to make the playoffs this year? What do you think needs to happen, I guess? Obviously healthy. That's the first thing every team
I think
wants.
health is definitely the number one thing. This team's definitely been riddled with random injuries throughout the last few seasons. Anytime they go on a streak or any kind of somewhat streak, they always get someone goes down or like you were saying earlier, like they were in a playoff position 20 games in and then proceeded to lose 14 games in a row. And not one of those games went to overtime, I think.
That's
It was
crazy.
14 consecutive 0 points. So even if you go 14 in a row and half the games are in overtime, that 7 point difference,
It's huge.
you're right in the playoff hunt at the end of the season.
Yeah.
So what I think needs to happen is I think this team needs to, for anything to go right, they got to definitely tighten up defensively throughout the year consistently at least. And I don't know, dude. This team is. I said it last year in the preview, and I said it. I'm going to say it this year minus one thing. I'm like, this team can finish dead last. This team could finish middle of the pack. This team could finish just outside of a wild card. Do I see them in a playoffs? No, I definitely don't. But like, I can't say. I personally don't see them being bottom five. I just can't see it. I just think there's too much talent on this roster, and I think the defense improved a lot more than people are willing to give him credit for. I think a lot of the pundits and writers and you yourself are putting them at the bottom just based on past experience because it's the easy pick. It's a team that hasn't made the playoffs in 14 years. It's an easy option to put at the bottom of the league because why not, right? Like they've done it the last 14 years. So
You're in
yeah,
you're in
sorry.
denial. First or second stage of
Denial.
grief.
Denial would be like they're making the playoffs. I never said they're making the playoffs. I just don't see them finishing bottom five. I'd put them in 20th in the league, probably
Okay, so
per
with
se.
that, this is our Atlantic Division preview, and I started off with the Sabres. Where would you put them in the Atlantic?
Probably put them confidently put them sixth.
Which
Wishful
two
thinking,
teams
putting them like
behind
fifth or
them?
fourth. I'd put them ahead of Detroit and Boston. I don't
Boston.
think
That's
I think Boston's Detroit's an interesting one too. Like for me, like Detroit's just like they look solid, but the last 2 years have just collapsed in the last half of the season both times. And
yeah.
then Boston, like I know Boston's Boston, like they always find a way, but I don't know. While watching those last 20 games of that season last season, they were bad, and it was
They were
bad
bad.
hockey. So.
Yeah, Boston
My
being
wishful thinking
Boston.
is,
That's the
yeah,
only reason why I put them ahead of Buffalo is because
it's because it's
Boston's
Boston.
just
I get it.
they
So
find a
wishful
fucking way to do
thinking,
it.
I'm wishful thinking fifth. Realistically, I think sixth or seventh, but I do not have them eighth. I definitely have Boston at eight, just because that's just not a good lineup all the way through the. Like
Yeah,
I
fair
couldn't even
enough.
name you their third line center, let alone their
Okay.
first line center.
And actually, one more for you. You mentioned the slump. A lot of that's on coaching, right? I assume you're not a big Lindy Ruff fan.
Used to be back in the early 2006, 2007 eras. I was loving him. Now I don't know. Like he hasn't really proven anything to me. I thought the coaching hire in general was weird when they did it the first time, like when they rehired him last season. I thought it
Yeah,
seemed a little bit rushed and more of a nostalgia hire than anything else. Um, but then again, this goes up to ownership and management. Just you burn through coaches. I think how many coaches they had in the last like 5 years, 6 years, like probably four, three or four. Like that's too many if you're gonna have that much of a turnover and you expect anything different. Because then you got the players learn new systems every season going in, and the moment they get the hold of it, you fire the coach and you bring someone else in. So to me, how this team's definitely the two factors that are going to prove if they can do anything outside of what the expectation is this season would be goaltending being consistent, which it has not been the last couple of years, and just full defensive game being implemented and like executed properly. Because the one thing I've known about this team is like they can score. They have good scorers. They have people that can definitely put the puck in the back of the net, like Kulich and Thompson and Tuck and now Benson and you got Zucker. Like those guys can all bury the puck at will. So really hopeful, but like you said, it's I'm not being a delusional fan here thinking we're making the playoffs because that's just not a realistic thing. But I honestly, I just my thing is I just can't see them finishing eighth. I just don't see it. But everybody's entitled to their own opinion, you as well. So I'll accept it. I get it. It's the easy pick. So
yeah, it is. Hey, anything can happen, like you said. That's the beauty of hockey. All right, man.
mhm.
Thanks for coming on. You got anything else to add before we move on to our next team in the Atlantic?
um, yeah, Pagula should sell the team. Like, that's basically where I'm at this point with them.
I could
And
start the
that would make me happier than any standing finish possible.
yeah, yeah, fair enough. All
Yeah.
right, man. Thanks. Hey, feel free to join me throughout the season. I like your
Yeah, if
Sabres
you ever
input.
need a second voice, I'm definitely up to give my opinion, not just on the Sabres, but on any other team as well. So,
Good shit.
yeah. Thanks for
Appreciate
having me
that.
on, Alex.
All right, man. Well, hope some good luck for the Sabres.
Thanks, man. Much appreciated.
All right. Another thank you to Stephen Prospero for stopping by to give his take on the Buffalo Sabres. Next up on our list, and finishing seventh in the Atlantic, is the Boston Bruins. Now, I'm going to be completely honest, talking about the Sabres in even more detail off the air with my buddy who you just heard. It had me really considering putting the Bruins at the bottom. Not just because they finished dead last year, but simply because their team on paper just isn't it. The only reason I'm scared putting them so low is because they are the Bruins and they somehow always remain relevant. Now, that said, it feels so damn good putting them near the bottom and putting them down here at seventh and far away from a playoff position in the East. So, we're going to roll with that. Last season, the Boston Bruins finished in last place in the Atlantic with a record of 33, 39, and 10. Their first time missing the playoffs since the 2015-2016 season, and their first time below 500 since the 2006-2007 season, which is pretty crazy. The Bruins have remained relevant somehow, always avoiding a complete rebuild and instead just using a few retools to find themselves with one cup and three finals appearances in the last 15 years. Now, going one step further, no team has won more regular season wins than the Boston Bruins in the last 25 years. And only three new franchises, obviously Vegas, Seattle, and Utah, have fewer goals against this century than the Boston Bruins. But finally, all that is over. So what happened to the Bruins? Well, aside from most of their core retiring, guys like Big Z, Chara, Patrice Bergeron, David Krejci, but what happened last year to the Bruins that made them drop off so significantly and only 2 years removed from the most dominant regular season of all time? You can say that this disastrous season all started back last summer or last training camp when starting goalie Jeremy Swayman remained unsigned. Now, we all know how that messy situation was handled by Don Sweeney and company. And Swayman never really found his game. Eventually, they did get him signed, but he wasn't the same goalie that he was the previous year. And the Bruins suffered from his subpar play and from some tough injuries, including star D-man Charlie McAvoy and Hampus Lindholm. They ended up firing their head coach and Jim Montgomery and promoted longtime assistant coach Joe Sacco, who didn't really do much better. And then all this led to a complete blow up at the deadline, trading away guys like Trent Frederick, Charlie Coyle, Brandon Carlo, and most notably their captain and legendary NHL rat Brad Marchand. So with this, it was inevitable that David Pastrnak would not be able to single-handedly will this team into the playoffs. So here we are, their first 6-month offseason in a long time. So let's take a look at what they did with all this time to reflect and improve. Most of the losses were the players that I mentioned above that were dealt at the deadline, but they also lost a couple of other names that you might recognize: Parker Witherspoon, Cole Kepka, Vinny Lettieri, and Jakub Locko. So again, the bigger names that they lost were at the deadline last year. Some of the additions from the offseason: Victor Arvidsson from the Edmonton Oilers, Tanner Jeannot, Sean Corrali, Mikey Esimont, Jordan Harris, Alex Steves, and Mate Blumel. They also extended their 2020 second round pick, Mason Lohrei, to a 2-year deal, which is a pretty significant extension because he was one of their best D-men last year. So, what does this mean? What does the Bruins lineup look like going into the season? The one name that's keeping them from being an absolute laughingstock is superstar David Pastrnak, who somehow was able to put up 43 goals and 106 points last year during the dreadful Bruins season. Another positive was career highs in both goals and points from their likely first line center, Morgan Geekie, although he did play a lot of games on the wing last year. 33 goals and 24 assists is not bad at all for the 26-year-old, but of course, a lot of those points can be credited to playing with a guy like Pasta. Now, last summer, I released my list of the top 10 best off-season signings. I posted that on our Instagram page, and I am yet to do that this summer. I'm a bit hesitant because of how bad my list was last year. I had Elias Lindholm as the second best signing of the summer last year, and boy, did that turn out badly. I will say, when I released my list, a lot of my buddies criticized it, but I stood my ground. I stood by my list, and now I definitely feel foolish. Almost like I shouldn't be in a position doing something that involves sharing my opinion of something that I claim to have a good mind on. Oh well, away she goes. Elias Lindholm finished the season with 47 points in 82 games. Now, that, might be serviceable numbers for a third line or even a second line center, but definitely not a first line center making almost 8 mil a year for the next 7 years, or 6 years, excuse me. It should be mentioned that when all three of those first line players I just mentioned, so David Pastrnak, Morgan Geekie, and Elias Lindholm, were all healthy and playing together on that top line under coach Sacco, they actually put up some decent numbers, including a nearly 65% of expected goals for. Now, we're going to see how new head coach Marco Sturm decides to play around with this line, whether he keeps them together or splits them up. I would assume he's going to keep them together because, like I said, decent numbers last year and pretty much the only bright spot the Bruins had last year, and their lineup this year doesn't look that much better. Things really drop off after that first line. Their second line right now will likely consist of newly acquired Victor Arvidsson, who used to put up decent offensive numbers but had a pretty bad year. I shouldn't say bad year, a down year last year in Edmonton. And funny side note, he also made my list of the top 10 signings last year, which was another big miss. I would guess he's going to play on that second line with Casey Middlestat and Pavel Zacha, both those guys being interchangeable at the center role. Puckpedia has their newly acquired Matej Blumel on that second line. And to be honest, I've never even heard of this dude. He's a 25-year-old with 13 NHL games under his belt, recording only 2 points to his career. So I don't know who's making the projected lines at Puckpedia. Not sure if they see something that I haven't seen, but hey, I'm not one to criticize after my top 10 list from last summer. The rest of their forward core is filled with more names that I don't really know, along with a $7 million invested in four-checking grinders like Tanner Jeannot, Sean Corrali, and who am I missing? Michael Esimont, who played with Tampa last year. I actually like that player quite a bit, but he definitely isn't really a game changer who's going to turn a bunch of heads in Boston this year. I think it's safe to say that a good 80% of their offense is probably going to come from those top two lines, and a little help from their blue line as well. Health is always the biggest key in professional sports, and although the Bruins' defensive numbers were quite bad last year, it's definitely fair to assume that there will be some improvement this year. Losing Lindholm in November and then McAvoy at the Four Nations last year left Mason Lohrei as their top D-man, especially after Brandon Carlo was shipped off at the deadline to the Toronto Maple Leafs. No offense to Mason Lohrei, the big young defenseman, but you're not winning many games with him leading the way on the back end. By the way, he had a league worst minus 43 rating last season. I guess some would argue that Nikita Zadorov was maybe their top D-man down the stretch after the injuries and the trades. But guess what? He was also on my list of top 10 signings last summer and also not the guy that you want leading the way on the blue line. So, with all that said, there really isn't much to look at for this Bruins team to give hope to their fans. If we look at things optimistically, a healthy Bruins squad still has the building blocks to push back into relevance. You know, they have a top 5 winger in the NHL in Pasternak, a top 10 D-man in Charlie McAvoy, and maybe at his best a top 7 goaltender in Jeremy Swayman. Another thing for Bruins fans to like is that they have 2 first-round picks in the next 2 drafts, which is not bad. You know, that's what you want from a team who's rebuilding. Not that they've admitted to being rebuilders, but I mean, where else are they going? So there are some bright spots in Boston. Don't forget they also drafted James Hagen this past summer, who did slip in the draft. He's got some skill to him, so I'm sure he'll be in the Bruins lineup, you know, in the next 2, maybe 3 years. Although I think that would be a bit disappointing if he didn't make the team next year. But these positives are few and far between for the Boston Bruins. Unfortunately for them and their fans, but probably fortunately for most other hockey fans out there, the Bruins team is not making it far this year. All right, time to move on. Next up, our 6th place finish in the Atlantic Division and missing the playoffs yet again are the Detroit Red Wings. Spoiler alert, this is where my list will get slightly repetitive, as I think the middle of the pack teams in the Atlantic aren't really going to change much from last season. Now, that's me being not very bold and kind of going with the safe bet, but also that is what I believe looking at their lineups. The Red Wings are also in a bit of a playoff drought themselves. Actually, a bit is putting it nicely. They've missed the postseason the last 9 years. And the Red Wings players that I grew up watching are probably rolling in their beds, or whatever the equivalent expression is for people who are still alive. A franchise that used to be so dominant, making the playoffs every year from 1991 to 2016. That's 25 years of straight playoffs, and now they just can't seem to get back into the mix. Similar to what we were saying about the Sabres, I think management just hasn't been able to make the right moves. They've made a lot of questionable decisions, and many of which aren't being looked into enough because of the big name behind it all in Steve Yzerman. Sure, he was a legendary player for this club, and he did turn the Tampa Bay Lightning into a dynasty before leaving and joining the Detroit Red Wings, but he's just been given way too long of a leash as the GM of this team. And I've been saying it for years now that it's time for him to go, or at least time for him to be sitting on a burning hot seat for this upcoming season. 2 years ago, the Red Wings were inches from a playoff spot, but then they missed out on the last game of the season. They had nobody but themselves to blame, though, because they had a very disappointing stretch in March and April. And then the same thing happened last season. They really shot themselves in the foot late in the season. Now, unfortunately, last year they were also very cold out of the gate. They started the season 13, 17, and 4, which led to coach Derek Lalonde being fired. But that probably was the best thing that could have happened to this team because they were able to bring in veteran coach Todd McClellan. And his impact was quickly noticed with the team going 17, 5, and 1 after his hire. But then, unfortunately, that tough start and the inconsistency of this team led to more slumps later in the season and then ultimately an early end to their playoff hopes. So, looking at the offseason, what did they do to hopefully get themselves back into playoff hockey? First, the departures. Goaltender Alex Lyon, goaltender Peter Mrazek, veteran defenseman Jeff Petrie, Tyler Mott, and Craig Smith. And Vladimir Tarasenko, sorry. Can't forget that name. And then the additions. John Gibson, James Van Riemsdyk, Mason Appleton, Jacob Bernard Docker, and Travis Hamonic. Now, the biggest addition for this team, and clearly a hole that needed to be addressed, was acquiring John Gibson as their new starting goalie. You can argue that this move was the most significant move for any single club this summer. This team has needed a proven goaltender for quite some time, and now they've finally got one. That said, John Gibson hasn't really played meaningful hockey in a while. He's been on a team that hasn't been near the playoffs or had any real playoff expectations for years now. And weirdly enough, I say that this was a hole that needed to be addressed for the Detroit Red Wings. But if you look at the numbers, Cam Talbot and Alex Lyon, and not really Billy Husso, but the three of them kind of held their own last season. Their numbers weren't necessarily as bad as you might think. Now, they did have an atrocious penalty killing unit. And while that's not all on the goaltender, that obviously is the most important position in stopping a power play unit. But nonetheless, having John Gibson in town, and they still have veteran Cam Talbot backing him up, that's a solid duo for this squad, and the best that they've probably had since Jamie Howard called it a career a few years back. All right, let's look at this team's offense. We know that this team can be very dangerous offensively. They've had flashes of brilliance from young studs like Lucas Raymond and Alex DeBrincat, as well as proven ability from future Hall of Famer Patrick Kane. But no offensive player has been more valuable to this team than their captain, Dylan Larkin. Even considering he had a down year last year, he still put up 30 goals. And his chemistry with their team leading point producer, Lucas Raymond, has turned their power play into a very dangerous one. They finished the season with the fourth best power play unit and the overall best power play after Todd McClellan took over behind the bench. The key player to watch on Detroit's offense this year for me is 20-year-old Marco Casper, who looked pretty solid playing between DeBrincat and Kane last year. He put up 37 points in his rookie campaign. Now, he definitely needs to work on some things, especially the faceoff dot. He put up a 44.9% at the faceoff dot, and that's really, really not good for a centerman, especially a second line centerman. But his overall game does show a lot of upside. So he's definitely a guy to be watching for this Detroit Red Wings team. Now, where things get a bit ugly for this roster, and this is the main reason I have them so low on the list, is their decor. After Moritz Seider, who is a hell of a player, the rest of their blue line is filled with question marks. A team that already struggled hard defensively last year saw their GM Stevie Y inexplicably throw away Jake Wallman and Oli Mata. But they traded Jake Wallman for absolutely nothing to the Sharks. Actually, even worse than nothing. They sent a second round pick with him just for the Sharks to take him for free in return for nothing. And then you know what the Sharks did? They flipped him to Edmonton at the deadline for a first round pick. Somebody explain that to me. I'll wait. Except I can't wait because I'm never going to get a logical answer for that. That did not make any sense to me. Jake Wallman was not a liability at all, and I know you can say, oh, teams do this to shed cap space. He really wasn't making that much money. He wasn't taking that much cap space, and this team needed defense. I can't remember if that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me, or if it was another one of the brainless moves that Stevie Y made. Um, but I don't know. I just can't understand how he still has a job after a lot of these moves and after this team has not made any sort of movement towards the playoffs in 9 years. All right, let's get back to some of the positives at least before we continue to bash their blue line. Moritz Seider. He's a beast and probably one of the most underrated D-men in the league. He's never missed a game in his career. He's never averaged less than 22 minutes and 22 seconds on a season. And he's never recorded fewer than 151 hits, 161 blocks, and 42 points in a single season. He's a righty who can skate, can hit, can score, and as per puck IQ, Moritz Seider logged the most ice time against elite competition of any player in the 2024-2025 season. Now, this can be concerning as it may be wearing down the young D-man. They definitely need to give this guy some help. And that brings me to the next bright spot on their blue line, and that's Simon Edvinsson. Another big young D-man who paired very well with Seider early on in the season, eating up a fair share of minutes himself, averaging over 21 per game this past season, and obviously mostly against the opposition's top lines. But unfortunately, Todd McClellan had no choice but to split these two guys up because he didn't want to leave the other 35 minutes of hockey as open season on his goaltenders. Next up on their depth chart on the blue line would be veteran Ben Sherratt. And I am the first person to say that I used to love his game since he was a big part of that Habs Cup run. But that was 4 years ago, and he just isn't the same player. He's still a good physical presence who can clear the crease, but at best, he's a bottom pairing guy on a good team. Or in this case, a second pairing guy on a very mediocre team. And then daily faceoff shows the other three D-men in their lineup as Albert Johansson, Eric Gustafsson, who are both pretty small in terms of NHL D-men, and then finally Jacob Bernard Docker, who was a first round pick by the Ottawa Senators a few years back, but never really became anything more than a bottom pairing player. One guy who's not listed here, who was a late-ish signing this summer, who I did mention earlier on, is Travis Hamonic, who's a nice, sturdy veteran D-man, but again, not a guy that will move the needle much for this team. It'll be hard to see a team that desperately needs to make another playoff appearance miss out yet again, but that is where I see the season ending for the Detroit Red Wings. Next up, at fifth place, and honestly, I'm not confident enough to lock them in a playoff spot. I know last year Atlantic had the five playoff teams in the East, but this year I'm not too sure, especially with the emerging metropolitan teams. I know the New York Rangers are going to have a bounce back season. I know the Columbus Blue Jackets are going to keep pushing. And then obviously the close competition in the Atlantic Division. But anyway, for the fifth spot, I have the Montreal Canadiens. Now, let me start off with a very biased statement, and I promise this will be the only biased statement I make during these division previews. The Montreal Canadiens will be the most exciting team in the NHL to watch this year. I cannot wait to be on the edge of my seat throughout the season. There's going to be a lot of screams, a lot of cheers, a lot of head shakes, a lot of hair pulls, and maybe even some tears while I watch this team. But without a doubt, it's going to be a hell of a ride. Now, I don't know if it's because I live in the city of Montreal, so I see it everywhere I go, but it seems like there's so much hype surrounding this team over the offseason. And honestly, specifically about Demidov, the hype is so excessive that it's pretty much impossible for this guy to live up to it, unless he somehow breaks Solani's rookie goal scoring record and Gretzky's single season point record in the same season. That's how crazy the rumblings have been around this player in this city. But what do you expect out of the hockey mecca of the world? All right. Let's get to the real season breakdown for the Montreal Canadiens, a team that definitely surpassed expectations last year, squeezing into the playoffs with a 40, 31, and 11 record, their first season above 500, and their first playoff appearance since their Game 5 loss in the Stanley Cup Finals back in 2021. The season sure as hell did not start off like it finished in Montreal. By early December, the Montreal Canadiens season was pretty much finished. They were at the bottom of the Atlantic and 31st in the entire NHL. But then things started to turn around. And weirdly enough, I somewhat credit the turnaround to the trade that sent Justin Barron to Nashville for Alex Carrier. Not that Carrier was a game changer on the ice, but having a reliable right-handed D-man was something that this team really needed, and it kind of helped change the dynamic of the team, shifting the other D-men into the right place. And then, after their leader Nick Suzuki was left off of Team Canada, just like we talked about with Tage Thompson, I believe that Suzuki took that personally and went off. He was without a doubt one of the best players in the league down the stretch of the season, helping push this team over the Blue Jackets for that last playoff spot. Now, although the playoffs ended in an early 5 games, there were so many bright spots for this young team. And actually, it should be mentioned that they were the youngest team in the NHL last year. And I believe, Randy, fact check this for me quickly. I believe they were the youngest team in NHL history to make the playoffs. Career years from guys like Suzuki, Caulfield, Slavkovsky, and then, of course, the Calder and record setting season by Lane Hudson. This fan base was more than satisfied with a first round exit. At least I was, speaking for myself. So let's look at what this team did in the offseason in order to hopefully make another big push next season. A lot went on in Montreal. It might have been the most active team in the offseason. Let's look at the players that left. Emil Heineman was traded to the New York Islanders. Christian Dvorak signed with Philly. Michael Pezzetta signed in Toronto. Yoel Armia went to the Kings. Raphael Harvey-Pinard went to Pittsburgh. Alex Barré-Boulet. Logan Mailloux traded at St. Louis. David Savard retired, and then goaltender Caden Primo signed in Carolina. The additions for the Montreal Canadiens: Zachary Bolduc, Samuel Blais, Joe Veleno, Noah Dobson, Mark Del Gaizo, and Capo Kakkonen. Now, the Dobson trade. That's where we got to start. It was probably the biggest move of the summer. The Habs sent 2 first-round picks to the Islanders in exchange for this 25-year-old D-man. Then they immediately signed him to an 8-year deal. Or actually, to be more specific, I think it was a sign and trade. The Islanders signed him and then traded him. Either way, 8-year deal with a cap hit of $9.5 million. The Habs' highest paid player. And that is until Hudson signs his deal next year. This was a very risky trade and an even more risky, or riskier, great grammar, signing by the Habs. Noah Dobson is coming off a down year, cutting his point total almost in half from the previous year. That could likely be attributed to the Islanders having a bad season and missing a lot of their offensive weapons, but still, paying a D-man that much after he really only put up one elite season always comes with its fair share of questions. Despite his big frame at 6'4", he plays a very similar style game to Lane Hudson. He's a very good skating, shifty D-man who definitely excels more offensively than defensively. But that said, I mentioned how important it was to get Carrier for the Habs, a right-shotted D-man. Well, now they have another right-shotted D-man for that top pairing. Now, I can go through every player on this roster and tell you what needs to be done from them. A lot of the players had their best seasons last year, and I hope that they can do it again. But then there were other players who really need to make a step for this team if they want to be true contenders in a few years. In back-to-back seasons, the Habs traded first-round picks and a little bit more to acquire young centermen Kirby Dach and Alex Newhook. This was done at back-to-back drafts. And unfortunately, neither have proven that they can fill that much-needed role of 2C for this team. If Dach can stay healthy, there is a chance that he could fit into the role, but that is a major if for one of the most injury-riddled players in the NHL. Alex Newhook is so frustrating. He's a player that shows tons of skill, incredible speed, but just lacks finish. Lacks is an understatement. His numbers show that he has no business even in the top 6. Not yet, at least. He's still young. But he needs to make a big step up. I would love to see him in that 2C role, but he hasn't looked anywhere near being ready for that. A full season of Patrick Laine can really help this team, though he also has a lot to prove himself. He scored a large majority of his goals on the power play last year, and more often than not, he was a liability on the ice at 5-on-5. So that's going to need to change if he wants to stay in the team's top six and, more importantly, get a chance to play with this young upcoming superstar Ivan Demidov, or Ivan Demidov, excuse me. There's too much to say about Demidov, and honestly, so much that I don't really want to say anything. Go watch the tapes, go read the hype if you haven't already seen him. Kid's got a ton of talent, ton of skill, but there's no need in me talking more about it. We'll see what happens this year. He's only a rookie. It could go either way. But like I said, the hype is kind of blown out of proportion that I think it's not really fair to expect that much, I should say, from this kid. It's been overwhelming for me, even that I don't want to read anything more about this guy until I see him play a full season. Kid's a stud, though. I'll say that much. Now, aside from Noah Dobson, the main new face in town is Zachary Bolduc. While the Dobson trade took over the headlines for the Habs this summer, I think the Bolduc trade is also a bit of a blockbuster in its own right. Two first round picks from the same draft were swapped one for one. Logan Mailloux for Zach Bolduc. And there was a lot to like from Logan Mailloux's game. And he has no doubt NHL talent. I'm sure he's going to make that St. Louis Blues roster, if not this year, then next year. But I'm sure he's going to get some reps this year because he's a big, solid D man. But with Noah Dobson coming in, there really was a logjam on that right side. So it made sense for both teams to get the deal done. Bolduc is a player who battles hard. He has a great shot, adds some much needed toughness to this team. So I think it was a great trade for the Habs. And like I said, I think Logan Mailloux is going to be a great player for the Blues. So hopefully it's one of those trades that works out for both sides, both teams, both players. Let's look at the Habs defense. While they're still very young, this is probably their strongest part of the team, in my opinion. For now, let's look at the top line as Lane Hutson and Caden Gooley. Hutson just came off a Calder winning season. Everybody knows what he can do. Any hockey fan, I should say, has heard of this kid and seen what he can do. Caden Gooley, I think, is very underrated. Solid D-man, throws the body around, eats pucks, not too flashy, but can play on the offensive side. I think he's going to complement Lane Hutson's his game very well. And he's also quite young himself. So, like I mentioned, this whole decor is very young. The second pairing, Mike Matheson, who's coming off a down year, still decent, but a down year. Honestly, a lot of Habs fans kind of were hoping for the Habs to trade him. They didn't like how he played last season, but I think that's just because he set the expectations so much higher with his performance 2 seasons ago when he had a career season. I still like Mike Matheson. I like him for his value. He's not getting paid too much. Having him on this second pairing with Noah Dobson, I think, is going to be a great fit. And then the third pairing of Arbor Jacki and Alex Carrier. Like I said, Alex Carrier came in last year. The team really turned things around. He was playing a second pairing role. So having him down on the third pairing with Jacki could be Struble. They're kind of back and forth for that sixth D-man role. But Jacki, there's a lot of pictures of him. He's shed a lot of weight. He's gotten a lot faster, but he's still obviously got that toughness. He's one of the biggest, heavyweights in the league in terms of fighting. Um, I will say this: the Habs were very lucky last year in terms of health, aside from Kirby Dach. So I wouldn't expect that to happen again. I do think they're going to have to look to some of their depth, some of their AHL players to get a chance on this team. But it's a good thing that they're not too thin on that front. I just mentioned Jaden Struble as the seventh D man, so I'm sure he's going to be getting at least 20, even 30 games this season. And then there's the younger Jacki brother, Florian, who had a great showing last night at the preseason game that I mentioned I watched. He's been turning some heads in Montreal and at training camp. I don't think he's going to make the team, at least not on opening day. He might get a few reps this season, like I said, with injuries happening. But he's really, really proven himself to want that role and battle for an NHL spot. He fought Nick Delorier last night, which is insane. Delorier is one of the best fighters in the league, and this kid was brave enough to go him. I don't think he beat him. I think Delorier got the best of him. But still, that shows that this kid's got balls, and good for him. He, along with some other fringe players, have a lot to prove if they want to be on this team in the coming years, and that's a good thing. It's always good to have internal competition. Now, it wouldn't make sense for me to be putting the Habs at fifth when all I have to say about them are good things. I've been talking very positively about the Habs, so now let's talk about some of the question marks on this team. Part of the group leaving the Canadiens this summer were a very important group of penalty killers, pretty much their top unit. Yoel Armia and Christian Dvorak, and then shutdown D-man and puck eater David Savard. All three players gone from their first unit PK, and that is quite significant. They didn't really replace this part of their game, so they're going to have to look to players that they already have to learn how to penalty kill. Jake Evans is already a great penalty killer. Suzuki kills a lot of penalties as well, but they need at least two more guys to step up to the plate. My guesses would be Brendan Gallagher because he goes balls to the wall, he puts his body on the line, he blocks shots, and Josh Anderson, who did get some reps on the PK last year, and he just fits that role well. He's a power forward, skates well, also hits. He can block shots. I think both those guys could fit into the role well, but that still does not make up for the fact that they lost their best faceoff guy in Christian Dvorak and longtime penalty killer Yoel Armia. Their young defense will likely see some struggles killing penalties throughout the season. That is something that coach Marty St. Louis is going to have to groom them into if they want to win some hockey games. So honestly, that's my biggest issue is the penalty kill, and of course the 2C role, which is a big topic of discussion in Montreal. Like I said, it hasn't really been addressed. Hopefully, one guy can step in and do it, whether it's Newhook or Doc or someone new. But that's a big hole to have at that 2C, and we'll see what happens with the penalty killing. And then throughout the season last year, the Habs were very up and down, especially defensively. There were some games where they got blown out. I think Seattle lit them up for 9 goals early on in the season. Things like that. It happens with a young team, but if they want to become real contenders and if they want to make the playoffs again, and I mentioned teams like the Rangers are going to be fighting to redeem themselves from last season, the Habs are just going to have to prove that they can stay consistent and be responsible and show leadership in that locker room. My last point for the Habs is between the pipes. Samuel Montembeault showed that he can be a top 15 goalie in the NHL when he's on his game. And then backup Jakub Dobeš had a wild start to his career last year, winning 5 games in a row, including his first ever NHL game, shutting out the former Stanley Cup champions Florida Panthers. But then he came back down to earth once teams saw a bit more of his game and kind of analyzed his weak spots a bit. That said, he was a very solid goaltender in the playoffs when he relieved Montembeault after he got injured. And then the Habs signed NHL veteran Capo Kakinen, who many believe will be the backup of the NHL, with Dobeš splitting games in the AHL with goalie prospect Jacob Fowler. However, I think the better move is to keep Dobeš in the NHL as the backup. I understand wanting to give him more games in the AHL as a young guy needing to develop, but the Habs have the most back-to-back games in the NHL this season, so they're definitely going to need to look to their backup more so than usual. And I think last year they just overplayed Montembeault. They need to give him a bit more rest leading into the playoffs. So for that reason, I think Dobeš should stay up in the big leagues and get at least 25 games, maybe 30 games this season. So to end, I think there's no question that the Habs got better offensively, adding scoring weapons like Demidov, Bolduc, and then Dobson on the back end. But where this team took a big hit is in their own end, keeping pucks out of their own end, especially on the PK. Their defensive numbers were not great at times, like I mentioned, and the loss of a lot of these defensively responsible players, Dvorak, Armia, even Emil Heineman, David Savard, it's not going to go unnoticed for the team this year. My God, I could talk about the Habs all day. Let's move on. The Ottawa Senators, I think, are the fourth place finish in the Atlantic. And if I haven't already made it clear, this list, especially here in the middle, can kind of go either way for me. I could easily see the Habs finishing higher than the Sens, but if I had to bet, I'd probably have the Sens higher. And to avoid being completely flip floppy and contradicting, I will say that I am confident in the bottom 3 spots in the Atlantic. I'm confident that it's going to be Buffalo, Boston, and Detroit at the bottom. But the Habs and Sens are real close for me, as they were last year. And while the Sens didn't really make big offseason moves, not as big of a splash as the Habs, they made some small but necessary tweaks to their lineup that should still have them improving. Last year, the Sens ended a drought of their own. They made the playoffs for the first time in 8 seasons. The star players came together last year to push this team into the playoffs and giving all their young guns their first chance at playoff hockey. For a long time, the hockey world wanted to see playoff Brady Tkachuk, especially after we saw him unleashed at the Four Nations. All we wanted was to see playoff Brady Tkachuk, and we got that. Even though it was short lived as a first round exit to their rival Toronto Maple Leafs, it was nonetheless a great experience for this young hockey team and for hockey fans all around. That Battle of Ontario is always exhilarating. Before looking at the offseason moves for this team, it's important to note that their deadline swap of second line centers with the Buffalo Sabres hasn't really aged enough to give a real opinion on who the winner of that trade was. What we can say is that the Sens have a nice looking group of centers. Down the middle, they got Tim Stützle, Dylan Cousins, who was acquired in that trade that I just mentioned, and Shane Pinto on the third line. And then to top it off, they added a solid fourth line center in Lars Eller, who's a responsible veteran who might not light up the score sheet, but he can be trusted in important situations, especially in the defensive zone. And then, of course, adding a lot of leadership to this young team. In addition to that, they also acquired Jordan Spence on D and Arthur Kaliev. And they really didn't lose anyone that significant. Adam Gaudette, Travis Hamonic, Matthew Highmore, and then Anton Forsberg. None of those guys were game changers for this team. Adam Gaudette had some solid showings for Ottawa last year, but very replaceable. And I think their additions were a lot more significant than their losses over the offseason. Looking at this short list alone, it's easy to say that the Sens brought in a lot more good than they shipped out. After years of mismanagement under the Eugene Melnyk ownership, I think most Sens fans would be happy with the job that Steve Staios has done thus far. Now, looking at their numbers from last year, the Sens were a very middle of the pack team. Nearly 50% in 5-on-5 possession numbers, exactly the midpoint of the league in terms of goals for. And while their power play was above the league average, their penalty kill was slightly just below it. So, very mediocre team throughout the season. The big question for me looking at this team's offense is number one center Tim Stützle. And my question is simple. Was that sophomore year just a flash in the pan? Now, by no means do I think he's been a bad player since, but he hasn't really come close to reaching his 39 goal and 90 point season performance from 3 years ago. Now, the short answer to this question would be no, it wasn't just a fluke. The kid is only 23 years old. He shows tremendous amount of skill, but him taking that next step and being consistently around the 90-point mark would cement this offense as one of the most threatening in the league. In a perfect but realistic world, Stutzel puts up 90 points a season. Brady Tkachuk and Jake Batherson both put up 30 goals a season. Jake Sanderson continues to develop into one of the league's best two-way defensemen. And then there are other young guys like Shane Pinto, Ridley Gregg, Dylan Cousins. They all continue to grow into what their potential was. All that would put this team on the map as real contenders in a few years from now. If we look at just their top nine alone, first line, Brady Tkachuk, Tim Stützle, Fabian Zetterlund, who was a great acquisition from the Sharks last season. I say great. He actually was a bit underwhelming. When they first got him, I thought it was a great trade because I liked his game in San Jose. He didn't really do much in Ottawa yet, but give him time. He's new to the team. I think he's a great player, a good fit on that top line. Second line, David Perron, Dylan Cousins, Drake Batherson, and then that third line, Ridley Gregg, Shane Pinto, and Claude Giroux. Having Giroux on that third line, having David Perron on that second line, two veterans that are key pieces to this team, surrounded by young, talented players. That could easily be one of the deepest offensive in the league in years to come. And aside from Pinto, all these guys are signed for at least another 2 years. Now, not to say that that's, their window for a championship, but still, that's quite good to have this core, I guess, for the next couple of years. Now, while this team is likely to keep trending upwards, it is important to note that they lost their first round pick this year due to the whole Evgeny Dadonov situation, which led to the NHL penalizing them for making whatever the whole thing that went down that we've gone into in previous episodes. But because of this, they have to forfeit their first round pick, which is a pretty tough pill to swallow. Even if the Sens don't plan on finishing near the bottom half of the league, a first round pick is always a pretty valuable trade chip to have. So, tough break for the Sens there. Last thing to note about their offense, I mentioned the veterans David Perron and Claude Giroux. I think their performance is going to be very detrimental to this team. Both guys are 37 years old. They're both coming off mediocre seasons. But if they could be even just a glimpse of their former selves and just be a good fit for these young players on that line, I think they're going to be incredibly valuable to this team. Looking at their defense, most hockey fans know what a stud Jake Sanderson is, and I personally like Thomas Chabot's game a lot. But talking to a lot of fans who obviously know this team more than I do, I hear a lot of people overlook the play of Artem Zub. He's one of those defensive guys that don't really go noticed, but in a good way. Regardless of if he's paired against the team's top players or bottom six players, he manages to consistently fit the role and perform well for the Senators. And then there's the newest addition to the blue line in 24-year-old Jordan Spence. The Sens acquired him in the offseason from the Kings for a third and sixth round pick, which I think is a hell of a deal for the Sens. They didn't really give up too much for a guy who's got top four upside. And then with Nick Jensen and Tyler Clevin rounding out their bottom pairing, two solid D-men that could kill penalties, I'd probably say that this D-core is in the better half of the NHL. And then don't forget, they have a young prospect in Carter Yaremchuk who can definitely make the jump to the NHL at some point, whether it be this season or in years to come. He's projected to be a great NHL D-man if everything goes as planned. And then finally, between the pipes, they have Linus Ullmark, who they acquired for peanuts last year from the Bruins. I personally predicted him to have a down year. I thought his first year in Ottawa was going to be bad just because Ottawa kind of has a track record of not doing so well with goalies, but I was wrong yet again. He may not have been near his Vezina winning season, but he was more than solid with a 25-14-3 record and a 910 save percentage. We should note that his new contract is kicking in this year, though. So as of now, his cap hit is 8.25, which definitely isn't nothing for a goalie who missed nearly half of last season. So he's got a lot to prove this year as well. So while the Ottawa Senators did exceed expectations last year, I'd say they are a lot more stable of a pick to make the playoffs this year than the Montreal Canadiens, who are much more likely to regress or potentially much more likely to impress yet again this season. All right, now moving into our top three spots in the Atlantic, playoff teams who shouldn't be fighting with the Metro Division for the wildcard spots. Let's start off with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, I had them winning the division last year, and for a change, I was right. One thing I got right. Proud of myself. The Leafs had a great regular season last year. They finished fourth in the entire NHL. They had a 52-26-4 record, performing well both at home and on the road. But a lot of things have changed for the Maple Leafs this offseason. For a long time, we've been talking about the core four. The core four. Well, that's over now. It was a good run. At least in the regular season, it was a good run. But it only really amounted to 2 series wins since the core four were established with John Tavares coming home to Toronto in 2018. Now, Marner has packed up his things and left town. He went on to sign with Vegas, who somehow always manages to make room for superstars on their payroll. I don't know how they do it. Mitch Marner's exit from Toronto was a weird one. After this most recent playoff elimination in Game 7 to the Florida Panthers, he was receiving threats from fans, but not only directed at him, but his family as well, which is absolutely crazy. The guy plays hockey for a living, man. And he usually does a pretty damn good job, too. But in the month or two that he struggles, fans start calling for his head. Imagine having an off week at your job and then you have to start worrying about your life and your family's life. It's pretty messed up. But Leaf fans will always be a little deranged, so what you gonna do? With Mitch Marner gone, a lot of people have the Leafs dropping off hard. But I'm here to say, not so fast. I think this team will be a lot better than most people think, at least in the regular season. When it comes to playoffs, who knows for the Leafs? Uh, Brad Treliving did a pretty good job this offseason, and starting with the Mitch Marner situation, look, it got to the point where it was well known that he was leaving, but instead of losing him for nothing, the Leafs pulled some strings and managed to get a return out of him. Now, back when this happened, I was giving the Leafs shit, chirping my friends, because it was pretty much them being rats and tattletaling on the Golden Knights for talking to Mitch Marner too early. But hey, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying, right? I give the Leafs shit because that's what I would have done. If it was my team that did that, I'd be pretty pumped. Instead of letting Marner sign with Vegas as a free agent and getting nothing in return, they were able to trade him. And along with the fact that they did a sign and trade to give Vegas that one extra year of Marner's contract, they got back Nicholas Roy or Nick Roy. Now, if anyone who didn't know the details looked at this trade a few years from now, they would think, what the hell just happened? One for one, Mitch Marner for Nick Roy. That doesn't make any sense. But like I said, they got something for him instead of losing him for nothing, which was inevitable. And Hua honestly isn't a bad player. He's a solid bottom six guy, a depth piece that is a great ad for any team. He's a Stanley Cup winner after all, and that's not nothing. So, like I said, Brad Treliving, I think he did a good job there. Let's look at the rest of their offseason moves. Matt Murray signed a 1-year deal in Seattle. Pontus Holmberg signed with Tampa. Ryan Reeves traded to where was he? San Jose, excuse me. Alex Steves mentioned he signed with Boston. And then the additions. Mateus Michelli acquired from Utah. Nicholas Roy from Vegas. Henry Thrun acquired from San Jose. And Dakota Joshua acquired from Vancouver. So I mentioned Nick Roy, but the other two additions that I will label as underrated, I guess, because they aren't huge names, but they can definitely be big additions to this squad, are Dakota Joshua and Mateus Michelli. Look, the last few years, Toronto's problem was not their high-end firepower. They have had plenty of it. Obviously, the core four, like I said, it's been a thing forever. The core four. It was more so their defense, and then more recently, their depth scoring. Now, last year they addressed their defense, and this year it seems like they've addressed their depth. Is it perfect? No, but they've made some steps in the right direction. Matias Michelli showed some great upside in Utah and in Arizona, and he's already been practicing on the top line with Matthew Nyes and Austin Matthews. So, if he can be a good add-on to a top line, and they got him for only a third-round pick, that could end up being a steal. And I loved Dakota Joshua's game in Vancouver. A great bottom six who grinds, hits, plays hard, pots in a goal every now and then. And they got him for a fourth-round pick. So two great lowish cost moves to bolster the roster. Now, more importantly than these two additions or any of the signings that I just mentioned were the extensions that the Toronto gave to two key players this summer in John Tavares and Matthew Nyes. Let's start with John Tavares. What an absolute steal of a signing. He definitely took a hometown discount to try and help this team build a contender. While he's obviously on the back nine of his career, the guy still puts up 30 goals a season easily. Even finished last year with 38 goals in 75 games. To lock up a guy with those numbers to a 4-year deal under $4.5 million is huge. He's a great leader, an extremely skilled player, and then best of all, he loves playing in Toronto. Matthew Nyes also signed a great team-friendly deal. I won't say he took a hometown discount because he got paid for someone who's only played 2 full seasons, but he's shown what he can do, and it's a whole lot. He's looking like one of the league's few legit bona fide power forwards. At 22 years old, weighing in at nearly 230 pounds, he put up 29 goals and 5 more in the playoffs last year. I also had no idea he's born in Phoenix, by the way. So he and Austin Matthews are already butt buddies. Best buddies, excuse me. Fuck. Max Domi is another guy who loves playing in Toronto. And I just want to say this quickly. I always thought that he was a bit of a prick. Just watching his on ice antics and even the way he talks sometimes in interviews, never really liked the guy. But I will say, my sister works for a type 1 diabetes foundation. And so she's met Max a few times in person. And she recently told me that he's just an incredible guy. So kind, very easy to talk to, a really down to earth, wholesome dude who takes the time out of his day to visit hospitals and talk to kids with diabetes. A real, a true role model. And I got to give him some credit after hearing that. His father was a legend in Toronto, and this is clearly where he's meant to be. So I'm happy for him. He's obviously a dog on the ice, so I hope he can continue to be an important piece for his team. But I just wanted to share that because when my sister told me that, I very quickly changed my opinion of this guy. You never know what people are like in real life. You see them on TV, you see them playing the role that they're supposed to be. A guy like Brad Marchand, for example, I've hated him his whole career, as have a lot of NHL fans. But from what you hear from other people, apparently he's just the best. He's just a great dude, fun to hang out with, a hell of a hockey player. So you never know. You know, you see someone playing or doing their job. Often their job is to be disliked, but in reality, they're great people. So credit to Max Domi there. Now, I mentioned how the Leafs addressed their defense last year, and they did a pretty good job at it. Looking at their six rostered guys right now, there really isn't a weak point. There's nothing that you would hate about this D. You would argue that maybe one of those bottom pairing guys in Simon Benoit or Oliver Ekman Larson would be their weak point, but they're both pretty solid defensemen, especially for a bottom pairing role. Toronto always seemed to have a whipping boy on defense in the past. Remember Jake Gardner from years back, or even Brian McCabe before him. And last year I was so sure that it was going to be OEL, but he held his own. He was able to overcome his tough years in Vancouver with a breakout year and a Stanley Cup in Florida, and he hasn't really dropped down back to his shaky days in Vancouver. He may not be the number one guy that he was with the Coyotes back in the day, but he's definitely a solid player and a guy that you're happy to have on the third pairing. The Leafs honestly had pretty good defensive numbers throughout the year, so I don't have too much to say about this decor. Chris Tanev eats pucks, one of the best defensive defensemen in the league. Morgan Riley has been probably the most steady and reliable D-man out of that 2012 draft class. Jake McCabe and Brandon Carlo, while not flashy, they will get the job done. The only concern that I would have about this defense is, and I mentioned for the Habs, no team stays healthy all year and they don't really have too many great names in the pipeline. I believe Matt Benning would be the next the next in line, the first call up, and he's definitely struggled at times. But I mean, maybe that's something they will look to add throughout the season, a bit more depth on defense. And then finally, between the pipes, they had one of, if not the best valued goaltender last year in Anthony Stolars, making only 2.5 million, and on the last year of his deal, he's going to be looking to have a career season to give himself a payday, which is just what this team needs. Not the payday part, obviously, the career year. And then he's backed up by young Tendy and likely future Leaf number one goaltender, Joseph Woll. So while the Leafs lost a big name in Mitch Marner, and there's obviously no replacing him, they did do a great job at adding pieces that they needed, and I wouldn't be surprised to see superstars Austin Matthews and William Nylander step up their game even further in the absence of Mitch Marner. Okay, two more spots to go in the Atlantic. Next up on our list, finishing second in the Atlantic Division, would be the two-time back-to-back Stanley Cup champions, Florida Panthers. While there really shouldn't be a reason for them not to finish first in the Atlantic, I am pretty confident, willing to bet, in fact, that they won't finish first in the division. No team has played more hockey than these guys in the last 3 years, and Stanley Cup hangovers are no joke, especially considered how hard this team partied last year. I think they went harder with this cup celebration than they did the first one. The last Florida Panthers team we saw on the ice in June was probably the best hockey team I've seen in decades. Going back through all the cup winners, I don't know who I would say was better, unless we were looking at maybe early 2000 Red Wings. And it's funny because I said this very same thing about the 2021 Tampa Bay Lightning, but I think last year's Florida team was even better than that team, in my opinion. They were so damn stacked, it didn't seem fair. And you know what else isn't fair? The fact that they were able to keep everyone from their roster. They had three big name free agents, including the Conn Smythe winner, and somehow they brought back all three. And it's absolutely crazy. No team in the league is better built than the Panthers in terms of contract value. Looking at Sasha Barkov at 10 mil, Sam Reinhart at 8.6 mil, Evan Rodriguez at 3 mil, Aaron Ekblad at 6.1 mil for the next 8 years. Gustav Forsling at 5.75 for the next 7 years. Like, that's crazy. But all this wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the damn state tax advantage. By the way, I specifically mentioned those names above because I think those contract values are insanely good. But obviously, we can't forget about players like Kachuk and Bennett and Jones and Marchand, Bobrovsky, and so many others. But this state tax thing has been a topic of discussion for so long. And while some analysts and NHL execs have said that it isn't really an advantage and it's just made up and blah, 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 they're straight up lying. Brad Marchand came out and said it clearly that if it wasn't for the no state tax, there was no way Florida would have been able to keep all 3 of their pending UFAs. So that's definitely an advantage. And I mean, look at the last Cup winners. There's no way it's a coincidence. Florida, no state tax. Vegas, no state tax. Tampa, no state tax. In the last 6 years, only Colorado was able to win the Cup with state tax. So there's definitely an advantage. And the fact that this wasn't addressed in the recent CBA discussions is mind blowing. I've honestly been complaining about this for years on this podcast, even, but it was never fixed. And that sucks because we know they're not going to do another CBA discussion for God knows how long. The parity in the NHL is great. And I love the hard cap. I don't know why some people say they wish it was a soft cap. I love the hard cap. It makes it so there's no super teams like the NBA. Rich franchises can't just pay a luxury tax to get whoever the hell they want. It's great. But if they're going to implement a hard cap to make it a fair playing field for all teams, why not address this issue? Now, I wish I had a solution to provide because I don't. It's very confusing when it comes to trading players mid-season. How do how does their contract change going from a no state tax to a state tax? I don't know, but there's got to be a way. There's got to be smarter minds than me working at the NHL figuring all this stuff out. Like whoever came out with the LTIR, the whole, terms and conditions of all that, it's crazy. The detail, it's crazy. So obviously they look into this stuff deeply, and for whatever reason they did not address this, but they have to. They have to fix this to make it fair for all 32 teams. It's one thing that, weather is amazing in Florida and in Texas and in Vegas. That's already one attractive thing for players to want to go there, let alone making more money because of no state tax is just, oh, it's crazy. Anyway, I guess we need to move on. Let's look at Florida and what they did this offseason. Departures. The only key player they lost from their cup win was Nate Schmidt on defense. They also said goodbye to Nico Sturm, Vitek Vanacek, and Jacob Megna. They brought in Jeff Petrie, Luke Cunnin, and Daniil Tarasov. So in terms of additions, they really didn't do much, but obviously they did not need to do much since they brought back all the key pieces to their championship team last year. The signings that I mentioned, the 3 UFAs going into the offseason, most people were wondering, who are they going to keep? Which one are they going to target? Are they going to be able to bring back 2? Somehow, they brought back all 3. Sam Bennett signed an 8-year contract worth $8 million per season. Aaron Ekblad signed an 8-year contract worth $6.1 million a year. That's a steal. And then Brad Marchand signed a 6-year deal worth $5.25. For a guy who was pretty much a point per game player in the playoffs last season, and he really has been his entire career, it's a steal of a contract there too. It's unreal that Bill Zito was able to pull all this off. Now, for the sake of this Atlantic Division preview, we're just going to focus on the regular season. And if we look at Florida's regular season last year, they were honestly quite average, especially looking at their offensive numbers. 15th in goals for, 13th on the power play, only one 30-goal scorer on the team, that being Sam Reinhart, who put up 39 goals just 1 year after notching 57 goals in the 23-24 campaign. But a lot of this was due to the Panthers carefully resting a lot of their star guys throughout the season, and most notably Matthew Tkachuk, who didn't even play a single game after the Four Nations until the playoffs. But they even sidelined Barkov and Bennett and Reinhardt and even Marchand once they acquired him. So they really did a careful job at resting their guys for the time that matters most, which was the playoffs. Once April arrived, they were finally able to ice a near full squad. And those mediocre numbers that I mentioned before turned into dominance. I see a very similar script playing out this year for the Panthers. They aren't going to go balls to the wall every single night, playing guys hurt, because they don't need to. They have a good enough team to make the playoffs without risking any long term injuries to their big name players. Just looking at their lines right now, I'm looking at daily faceoff. That top line of Barkov, Reinhart, and Verhage, probably the best two-way line in the entire NHL. The Selke winner and the runner-up on the same line, and they're both sick offensively, by the way. Their third line that we saw in the playoffs of Luosterainen, Lundell, and Marchand, probably the best third line in the NHL. Their second line definitely will look a bit different to start the season, with Matthew Tkachuk likely sidelined until the new year after undergoing surgery. But I would assume that their young, talented winger Mackie Samoskevich is going to make the jump to play with Bennett and Rodriguez, or they might even bring up Marchand to shake up their third line. Who knows? Paul Maurice surely has a lot to play with here. And then we look at their back end. Honestly, it's not the most flashy or shiny looking decor in the league, but that doesn't mean it isn't the best. The value this team is getting out of these D men is incredible, but I've already said that enough. No team has allowed fewer 5-on-5 scoring chances than the Florida Panthers last season. And they even had the lowest expected goals against of any Eastern Conference club. And there's no reason to expect anything to change next season. Like I said before, the Panthers' only significant change on the blue line was Nate Schmidt. And while he was a very important player for this team, he's definitely a guy that you can replace. He was their third line D man, and they brought in veteran Jeff Petrie, who used to be a comfortable top pairing D man, but will now fit nicely into that bottom pairing role, likely playing alongside Dmitry Kulikov. The shutdown line of Gustav Forsling and Aaron Ekblad will not allow the opposition to do much in their defensive zone. Forsling is one of, if not the best defensive D man in the league, and we've all seen what Aaron Ekblad can do. He eats pucks, he puts his body on the line. Also, both these guys have reasonably good offensive sides to their game as well. And then there's Seth Jones and Nico Mikkola on the second pairing. I mean, there really isn't much to say about this defense. This core is the core that won them the cup last year. So, not many holes for me to pick away at. And then there's Bobrovsky between the pipes. Two-time Vezina, two-time Stanley Cup winning goalie at the top of his game. I may find it hard to argue any team in the East can beat these guys in the playoffs. I can definitely say that I think the next team on my list will surely edge them out in the regular season. Florida's going to be tired. They're going to be looking to rest guys. They're going to be looking at the one and only ultimate goal, which takes place in the spring. So there's no need for them to beat themselves up before getting there. And so that leaves us with our last team in the Atlantic, the top team on the list. The team we're predicting to finish first place in the Atlantic was one of the hottest teams in the second half of last season. In fact, in the months of February and March, the Tampa Bay Lightning were the best team in the East and the second best in the league only to the St. Louis Blues. So Tampa is my pick to win the Atlantic Division. And while they may have some question marks on their blue line, more so than the Florida Panthers, that's for sure, I think having the best offense in the NHL, which they did last year, can make up for their defensive deficiencies, at least in the regular season. Let's look at the offseason moves before we dive into the breakdown for the Tampa Bay Lightning. They lost Nick Perbix, Isaac Howard, Cam Atkinson, Connor Sheary, Derek Pouliot, and Matt Tompkins. They acquired Sam O'Reilly, Pontus Holmberg, and Jacob Pelletier. They also re signed Gage Goncalves. No matter how many times I hear announcers say his name, I still can't pronounce it right. And Yanni Gord. And goaltender Jonas Johansson. So none of these names really jump out at you. For the most part, this team is going to look very similar to how they did last year. I do really like the signing of Yanni Gord. 6 years with a cap hit of 2.33. Very, very cheap cap hit. He was a part of their back-to-back cup wins to start off the decade, and then they brought him back last year at the deadline. Now, he's not a driving force, obviously, you can tell by his cap hit, but he's a good depth guy that John Cooper is very familiar with. Tampa had great special teams last year. They were fifth on the power play and sixth on the penalty kill. I mentioned that they had the best offense in the league. They recorded the most goals for in the season. And obviously, the majority of that being credited to the top line, which very well may be the best offensive line in the NHL. Nikita Kucherov, who somehow has never won a Conn Smythe trophy, despite leading his team in scoring both times they won the Stanley Cup. He's put up over 100 points 5 times in his career now, and only less than 20 goals once in his 9 full seasons. Arguably the best passer in the game, complemented by two of the game's best goal scorers, and centerman Braden Point and winger Jake Getzel. That's a pretty good hockey formula right there. And then let's add another 90-point player to the mix, Brandon Hagel, who broke out last year with 35 goals and 55 assists, making Team Canada at the Four Nations and improving his point total every single year since he joined the Lightning. Having him on that second line with another Selke nominee and fellow Team Canada player, Anthony Cirelli, is a pretty dangerous second line that's going to get some time against teams' second or even third pairings. So going to be very hard to contain. Last year, they had a few different guys rotating on that second line wing, whether it was Connor Geeky or Gage Goncalves or Nick Paul, who will miss a bit of time to start the season. But that line always managed to be productive, and they were used in all sorts of situations. Now, Puckpedia has Gage, I'm going to call him that, on that wing. And I can tell you when these three guys played together last season, they had 59% of the shots on net while on the ice. By that, I mean they recorded a lot more shots for than against while they're all playing together on the ice. Now, it's not all perfect, and it's definitely not the team that they had in the early decade winning those cups. Their offensive depth does drop off a bit, but the names that are there really do fit the bottom six roles. Like their third line, for example, I'm looking at Puckpedia right now. Yanni Gord, Connor Geeky, and Oliver Bjorkstrand. Solid third line. Their fourth line, Pontus Holmberg, Zemgus Girgensons, and Mitchell Chaff. Those are guys they've been fourth lines their whole career. Zemgus Girgensson, has been a steady fourth liner, a captain in Buffalo. He fits that role very well. He's not going to get you, 40, 50 points, but he does his job well. He grinds. He's a leader. He's a guy that you want paying very, very little to play on that fourth line. Same with Pontus Holmberg, who they got in the offseason from Toronto. Sorry, they signed him as a free agent, but he played in Toronto last year. So while they may not have nearly the best top 9 in the league, it's still an offense that could win you some games. And then this is complemented by a superstar D-man and a superstar goaltender to back them up. And speaking of being surprised that Kucherov has never won a Conn Smythe, I'm also very surprised that Victor Hedman has only won one Norris Trophy. He did win the Conn Smythe over Cooch that one time, though, by the way, which is pretty impressive for a D-man. But I honestly think Victor Hedman has been the best all-around defenseman in the NHL over the last 10 years. Obviously, with the emergence of guys like Cale Makar and Quinn Hughes, who have, in a way, revolutionized the position, it's unlikely that Hedman's going to win again another Conn Smythe, another Norris, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he's still an elite defender two ways. He's massive. I believe he's 6'6", great shutdown guy. He's got great vision offensively, a good shot. So him playing alongside J.J. Moser and then Ryan McDonough and Eric Chernak on the second pairing as a shutdown pairing. And then last, and I guess least, no disrespect, they have Darren Radish and Emil Lilleberg on that third pairing. Two guys that were on the team last year. And while I personally didn't watch them very closely, I do remember seeing Darren Radish on the power play at times. But looking at their numbers here, I can tell you that they were pretty solid. They were just below average in terms of 5-on-5 possession and shooting numbers. But again, nothing to hate from a third pairing unit. So I guess hearing what I just said about Tampa and then hearing what I said about Florida, you're probably thinking it doesn't make sense that I have Tampa ahead. So to put it simply, the reasons I have Tampa winning the division, number one, their incredible firepower up front. We saw that last year as the best offensive team in the league. Number two, a core that has been together and been very successful together for some time, coached by one of the best in the game in John Cooper. Number three, the Panthers are likely going to be resting and hungover from their back-to-back cup wins. And then number four, the Leafs having a very new looking team up front. So I guess those first 2 points relate more to Tampa, whereas 3 and 4 relate to the other teams in the Atlantic. But that is why I have them finishing number 1. And that is all for our first division preview, our Atlantic division preview. And you know what I forgot to do, which I did last year, was the over-unders on the wins. So I'm going to pull up Bet365 real quick while I still have you. What are we at here? We're at an hour 44. It's a bit long-winded, but it's entertaining, right? It's good stuff. Let's see here. Let's start at the bottom with the Buffalo Sabres. Bet365 has their over-under at 84.5 points, and I am very much betting the under on that. Last year they finished with 79 points. It's going to be close. I mean, it's very possible that they get a few more points than last year, but considering I have them at the bottom of the division, it only makes sense for me to go there. Boston, Bet365 has them at 80.5, so clearly they say Boston's going to be the worst in the division. For that one, I'm going to go with the over. That's close, though. That's very close. They finished with 76 points last year, and while I do see them still being a bottom barrel team, they're not going to be as injured as last year. At least you would think so. I'm going to go the over on Boston. The Detroit Red Wings are the same as the Buffalo Sabres, 84.5. I'm going to go with the over there. They finished with 86 points last year. I don't see them dropping off too hard, even though I still don't have them in the playoffs. The Montreal Canadiens are set at 90.5 points. Definitely going with the over there. I think... Actually, they finished at 91 points last year. Like I said, they could go either way. They could improve. They could drop off. It's a tough one. I'm gonna go with the over though, because I think the Atlantic Division and the Metro, the East in general, is going to be more competitive. I don't think the Habs are necessarily going to be much worse, but just that battle for the wild card spot is going to be tighter. So I am going to go with the over for the Montreal Canadiens. The Ottawa Senators is set at 95.5 points. They finished last year with 97 points, and I think it's going to be right around that 95.5. I'm going to take the over just because I think they'll have a very similar season to last year, if not maybe a bit better. Don't see them hitting the 100-point mark, but anyway, we'll go with that for now. Maple Leafs at 99.5, another tight one. They finished with 108 last year. Like I said, they won the division. Not going to repeat that, but I am going to go with the over. Another tight one, though. Florida at 100.5. I guess it would not make sense for me to say under if I just said the Leafs are going to finish with higher than 99. I'm all over the place here, but I think I'm going under on Florida. They didn't even get 100 points last year. I don't see them doing any better. Like I said, they're going to be hungover from their win last year without Matthew Tkachuk for some time. Taking the under on Florida. And then finally, Tampa Bay's over-under is set at 102 points. So Bet365 does have them also winning the division. I guess I'm not too crazy myself. I'll take the over on 102.5. Tampa's going to have a good season, win the division, and finish with at least 103 points. All right. Thank you all for sticking with me for this long. I can almost promise you that the next couple episodes were not going to be this long. I don't have the CBA to talk about anymore, and I'm just going to blow through it, maybe spend a little less time on each team. Thank you all for listening again. Tune in, I think, next week and a couple days from now. I got a couple episodes to bang out before the start of the regular season on October 8th. Have a great week, everyone.
See through your glass ceiling, only reflections from the light. You can build your wall, I'll break it down with the back of my